Section 2. Qualia, deep in the brain? The next proposal Gray considers is an amalgam between top-down and bottom-up processing, as proposed by Ray Jackendorf in his intermediate-level theory of consciousness. Quote, "This holds that one is not normally aware of sensation unaffected by conceptual interpretation, nor of pure conceptual structure, but only of an admixture of the two that optimizes their mutual fit. The conceptual structure results from top-down processing, sensation from bottom-up processing, and conscious experience results at the point where these two forms of processing meet. This analysis seems generally to be true of cognitive consciousness of the external world, but not of many, perhaps any, of the bodily sensations. This is another way of saying that the latter, more often than not, lack intentionality. Still, it is worth pursuing Jackendorf's hypothesis as it applies to cognitive consciousness." End quote. This idea of a merging of incoming sensory stimulation with internal cognitive conceptual processing to produce qualia sounds initially similar to the behavioral flexibility theory of qualia presented in earlier units. The big difference, however, is that Jackendorf's theory calls for a merging with conceptual processing, whereas in the latter theory it is emotional reactions. These different neural phenomena originate in very different areas of the brain. Cognitive processing from the upper cortical regions, emotions from the deep limbic systems. Gray cites neuroimaging results which throw doubt on the notion of a substantial role for top-down processing in generating consciousness. Specifically, he points to, quote, Zecchi's hypothesis that visual conscious experience can result from activity in just one module of the visual perception system, with little, if any, additional activity in either higher cortical regions responsible for executive functions or lower parts of the visual system. So, under at least some circumstances, activity in V4 is sufficient to produce an experience of color, activity in V5, an experience of motion, and so on." End quote. Given this, Gray concludes that, quote, "Qualia are far more independent of cognitive influences from top-down processing than has hitherto seemed likely." End quote. This view is congruent with Gray's own ideas that, as he says, raw fields are just that. They can occur without any of the trappings of intentionality, spatial framework, feature binding, or the like. They can similarly occur in the absence of any manipulation by executive processes, attention, working memory, decision-making, etc." End quote. Gray describes how this view has been forced on him by the evidence. However, he says, quote, "It seems reasonable for now to conclude that separate types of qualia, such as colors, visual motion, sense, pain, and so on, each result from activity in a circumscribed neocortical region that is specialized in the analysis of the corresponding type of information, end quote. So, unlike Panksepp and Damasio, Gray doesn't directly link qualia with emotion, but he does clearly deny a role for higher-level processing in generating qualia. Gray is clear, of course, that the idea that qualia originate deeper in the brain does not mean that they are not then subject to manipulation by executive processes. There is a role for the prefrontal cortex or hippocampal system in organizing conscious experiences constructed in sensory neocortex, in selective attention or working memory, or to the service of problem solving or conflict resolution. And again, he promotes his thesis that the function of qualia is late error detection via a comparator system. Quote, among such top-down processes, I continue to see the comparator as holding pride of place, since so many features of conscious experience seem to make better sense in the light of this hypothesis, end quote.